Okay, it's 10 o'clock. I guess we'll get started. Just a few tech things before Terry and Donna take over. Just a reminder to raise your hand with the little hand icon if you have a question, or type it in the chat, and I'll be managing that. Any questions, let me know. You can start, Terry or Donna.
Great. Well, this is Terry Poor with the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence and also with the National Sexual Assault Coalition Resource Sharing Project. And I'm joined by Donna Greco with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And we are so pleased to be here with you today. And Peter, you can move us forward one. We're excited to be with you today to talk about housing protections for sexual assault survivors and to be working together with the three national organizations to do this presentation. Donna, would you like to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
Okay, and before we get started, we just want to thank some folks that helped us put together this presentation. And Peter, you can go ahead and advance the slide. We had some wonderful interns, social work interns from the Smith College of Social Work that worked with us on housing issues, and we also worked closely with the National Coalition of Organizations on Housing Issues, Donna and I, and that includes the National Housing Law Project, and they've been a good source of support for us as we put together information about the federal housing protections. And now I'm going to turn it over to Donna to talk about our goal and agenda for today. And
yes, Terry and I are so excited that these housing protections passed in VAWA. And our goal is really to hope that you walk away after today's webinar feeling more grounded in these housing protections that are now available to sexual assault survivors in public housing, and really how you can use your advocacy skills to support survivors in accessing them. So our agenda is we'll start by reviewing just some of the connections between housing and sexual violence and economic insecurity, and then Terry is going to walk us through in detail what these housing protections look like, and then we'll conclude by exploring some strategies that we can use in our local communities. And we can go ahead one slide. So before we started, we wanted to get a sense of where you all are at in terms of housing and sexual violence. So we have a poll for you. And if you could just take a minute and tell us how familiar you are with the connections between housing and sexual violence, with A being very familiar, B being somewhat familiar, and C being that you're at the beginning of your learning in terms of the connections of housing and sexual violence.
We have most of the people voted so far.
Great. And I am looking for what those results are. Are you able to see? Oh, there they are. So about 40% of folks are feeling somewhat familiar, and then 56% are just learning at the beginning of understanding the connections between housing and sexual violence. And this is really what Terry and I are seeing when we do webinars and trainings on housing and sexual violence issues. This is really what we're seeing nationally, that we all are really at different points in the spectrum. And so hopefully this webinar will really meet where you're at along that spectrum of learning. So thank you for taking that poll. Now we'll move on to the next slide. And you can go ahead, Peter, one more slide. So this is the first section on making connections. And Terry and I really wanted to start with this beautiful quote by the late Dr. Maya Angelou. And we start with this because we feel like it really helps to frame this ideal that we all are really striving for, to feel safe and secure and at peace in our homes and wherever we move through our lives and through the world. And we know that for many sexual assault survivors, that home is not a place that is feeling safe. Home can be a trigger or a reminder of sexual violence. It can be a place that's located in close proximity to the person who offended. And so we're so excited to talk about these protections today to really help make this ideal within reach of more and more survivors of sexual violence. We hear a lot of questions from folks in the community about what are these connections between housing and sexual violence, and they're very complicated and they're not always obvious on the surface. So when we think about where sexual violence takes place, we know that the majority of sexual violence is happening at home where survivors live. And we also know that there are long-term economic impacts of sexual violence, that sexual violence can really undermine a person's economic resources over time. So this is a really powerful statistic that you can use if you're ever asked that question in your local programs, in your communities. And if nothing else, you can really hold on to this, that sexual violence and housing are absolutely connected, given that the majority of sexual violence is happening at home. This is another powerful quote from an advocate in Pennsylvania when the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape conducted some focus groups around the state to better understand what the connections are between sexual violence and poverty or economic insecurity. And I think that this quote really helps us understand that sexual violence really can be a precursor and an outcome of homelessness. There are many studies, and I'm so excited that there is a growing body of literature that's really looking at these intersections. But there was a study done with runaway and homeless youth, and the study found that 61% of girls said that they ran away because of sexual abuse happening at home, and 16% of boys said that they had also run away due to sexual abuse at home. And so we know from the research and literature and from our own experiences as advocates that many people are in this catch-22 situation where they are forced to barter sex for basic needs such as housing. And people are really faced with either staying where they are, where they're feeling unsafe, or leaving and facing homelessness or substandard housing. We know from survivors that landlord sexual violence is very much an issue. We know that many folks are couch surfing and just trying to make ends meet and meet their basic needs for shelter, and that moving, just picking up and moving, is really not an option for many people throughout the country. In 2010, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center conducted a survey across the country. We heard from approximately 240 advocates from 33 states and 1 U.S. territory, and we really wanted to better understand what these connections were between sexual violence and subsidized housing. And when we asked about the needs of sexual violence survivors in subsidized housing, relocation was a huge recurring issue, that many survivors wanted to relocate and move after an assault, but again, picking up and moving, breaking a lease, and facing penalties for breaking leases was really not an option for many people. And also there wasn't a safer, more affordable place to go. So the most often cited reasons for wanting to relocate were that the perpetrator was living close by, that the sexual violence happened at home, making home feel unsafe. People felt that they were at risk for further sexual violence. People cited that landlords were refusing to repair locks and windows and make the physical environment feel safer. And again, this inability to move quickly enough to avoid future risk was a major issue. And I'm going to turn it over to Terry to talk about some of how these protections can really address some of those needs that were cited in the survey.
Great. Thanks so much, Donna. And you can forward the slide, Peter. So now we're going to really talk about housing protections, and we wanted to start with another poll. And so we're curious what statement best reflects your experience with subsidized housing programs, or public housing as it's sometimes referred to, are you very familiar with it, somewhat familiar, or are you just learning about subsidized housing?
Looks like we have most of the votes in.
Great. Okay, so about half and half in the somewhat familiar and the just learning place. So again, we're happy to be able to share this information with you, so maybe that you will be a little bit more familiar by the end of the webinar. And, you know, just to share that Donna and I have definitely felt on a learning curve with learning more about subsidized and public housing as we have stretched to be stronger advocates around housing issues on the national level. And I know I've found it confusing to learn all the different new types of housing and issues with housing. And I will say sometimes I feel like as anti-sexual assault advocates, we sort of have to be Renaissance women and men and know so much about so many different areas. So we hope that today helps you a little bit more in the area of housing. So we can go back to the presentation, and before we move on to talking about specifically, obviously, the VAWA protections, which is a focus for today, I just want to point out to you that, you know, sometimes states have stronger protections than those that are available in VAWA, or different or more protections, and the resources that you should receive as part of this webinar, there is a link to a legal momentum document that talks about all the different state laws related to housing, and I just actually tried that link, and I think it may, Peter, I may have not sent you, it didn't seem to work, and so I researched for it, and I can send you after the webinar the correct link that you can share with participants if folks are having difficulty with that. But there is a document from Legal Momentum that should be included with your resources that does give a state-by-state look at all the different housing laws that are available, and it does, with a quick look, it does seem like Wisconsin does have a state anti-discrimination protection. It seems like it may not go so far as to allow specifically sexual assault survivors to break a lease, but that it does have some anti-discrimination provisions. So obviously it's important to understand what, because we're going to be focusing mostly on federal law today and related to VAWA, it's important to understand what might be available to survivors specifically under Wisconsin or local law. And that's a little bit beyond, going into the details of that is a little bit beyond our presentation today, but we just want to make sure that folks are aware of that. Okay, but now to move on and talk about VAWA housing protections. And first of all, they're probably most all aware of this. It's important just to remember that public housing was established to provide decent and safe rental housing for eligible low-income families, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. And so tenants in public housing have to be income qualified to gain access to public or subsidized housing. And as you probably guessed or know for sure, there's often a long waiting list for public housing. So that's going to be a factor in advocacy as we talk through the different ways to advocate for survivors today. Okay, and so talking through, you know, another important piece for today is going to be advocacy with public housing agencies, and that's something we're going to return to several times as we talk today. And Peter, you can advance the slide now. Public housing agencies are the critical local agency that deals with public housing in those cities and areas around the country. And so it's going to be really important that you get familiar with your local public housing agency. And HUD actually has on their website, Housing and Urban Development, has on their website a map where you can find out information about your local public housing agency. And this is critical in terms of advocacy efforts that we're going to talk through later, that you have a relationship with your local public housing agency. So public housing agencies, or PHAs, they have actual housing stock, so actual units that they allow, that the tenants can qualify to live in. And then they also have things like Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, which those are where they will give a voucher to a tenant, and the tenant goes out to a private landlord who has agreed to ask for a certain rent and take a voucher as either part or all of that rent. So a lot of times people aren't living in the actual apartments that are considered public housing. They're living out in private market housing, but it's still considered public housing. It's often referred to as Section 8 or a voucher program. So let's talk about the status of the VAWA 2013 housing provisions. And it's to note that these provisions actually expanded the existing protections from VAWA 2005. And in VAWA in 2005, and I think, Peter, this slide actually has several clicks in it, just so you know, and you may have already realized that. That in VAWA 2005, the housing protections mainly protected survivors of domestic violence and, in some cases, stalking. So a main component of VAWA 2013 housing provisions is that it extends many of those protections and goes beyond those for survivors of sexual assault. So this is really the first time survivors of sexual assault have been specifically included for housing protection. The law, VAWA 2013 housing protections that were included in Violence Against Women Act are in effect now, and they are mostly self-executing, which just means that they don't require regulations to be in effect. There are some areas of VAWA housing that do require regulations from HUD, and HUD went through a public comment period for their regulations in the fall of 2013, and the National Alliance and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and several other national organizations provided comments on the regulations, and we are awaiting the final regulations now. So we don't know exactly what those are going to be. We're still waiting. But it's just important to note that while we're waiting for final regulations, that this law is in effect. So while housing providers and public housing agencies may be waiting to get, final regulations, it doesn't mean that as advocates we can't push for those laws to go for the benefit of survivors right now. So one key provision of VAWA 2013 is that it extended housing protections across several new housing programs. So for sexual assault, these protections would have been extended through housing programs for the first time. And then for victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking, VAWA 2013 went beyond VAWA 2005 to extend to new programs. So Peter, you can actually advance, I think, 2 slides. The next one's just an intro to this section. And we'll talk about covered programs. Now, you should have received, or I don't know if resources go out for your webinars before or after, but you either have received or will receive some resources from us. And one of them is a National Alliance to End Sexual Violence one-page handout on VAWA housing protections. And in that handout, there's a full list of the covered housing programs, so there's no need for you to frantically take notes right now. That should all be available to you. But just so that you know, programs that were covered in VAWA 2005 for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking included public housing, Section 8 vouchers, project-based Section 8, Section 202 supportive housing for the elderly, and Section 811 supportive housing for people with disabilities. And then the programs that were included in VAWA 2013 for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So now all these programs include sexual assault, include multifamily rental housing, the Beamer program, which is the below market interest rate program, the home program, the housing opportunities for people with AIDS program, and the McKinney-Vento homelessness program. And those are all HUD programs. And then there was one Department of Agriculture program, the Rural Development Multifamily Program, and one Department of Treasury program, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, that are also included in terms of public housing programs that are protected under VAWA. So let's turn to talking about some key provisions of VAWA 2013. First of all, VAWA 2013 includes protections from denials, terminations, and evictions from public housing based on sexual assault. So again, this protection was included in VAWA 2005 for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. But in VAWA 2013, sexual assault was added as a new protected group of individuals and also affiliated individuals to the victim. So for example, if there's a family living in public housing and the child is a victim of sexual abuse and there's a need to move because of that sexual abuse, that would be considered an affiliated individual to the victim. So that person would be included. So what would be an example of somebody that might be denied an admission to public housing as a result of sexual assault? Well, we are really still developing our understanding of how sexual assault survivors are impacted by all these different pieces, but one example might be if somebody had public housing in the past and they were sexually assaulted and felt like they had to leave the housing to be safe. And they may have written a letter to the landlord saying, I have to leave this housing to be safe, but there may have not been some sort of formal breaking of the lease. So say, for example, a couple of years later, that same person goes back to apply for public housing again, and they're told, wait a minute, you don't qualify because several years ago you owe this back rent for previous public housing that you left without formally breaking the lease. Well, in that case, either the person themselves or an advocate for that person could say, wait a minute, I left that housing because I'm a survivor of sexual assault, and in that case they could ask for this particular VAWA protection so that that wouldn't be held against them in terms of being admitted to public housing for the future. Often people think of a very typical domestic violence case situation for eviction, and of course in domestic violence situations that person might also be experiencing sexual violence in that relationship. But sometimes a victim might have to call the police several times as a result of abuse by the offender, or perhaps the offender has wrecked the apartment or that sort of thing. So if there's a situation in which a survivor is having to involve the police and the public housing unit says, like, oh, you're causing problems, you are making things difficult here, and for that reason, we're kicking you out, VAWA will protect that person from discrimination based on domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking. So we're still trying to figure out and think about, and I invite you all to help us and work together on this to develop a sexual assault context for all these different protections. As Donna mentioned in the beginning, in some ways it's new to think about all these different protections through a sexual assault lens, so we're still really developing that. In Donna's work at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, really collecting stories from advocates about what they're seeing in terms of housing advocacy, one thing that's come forward really strongly is that there are a number of cases in which tenants in public housing are being coerced or forced into some sort of sexual relationship with the housing manager or landlord in order to keep their housing. So, in other words, a landlord saying, if you don't have sex with me, or just straight up sexually assaulting the person, then I'm going to kick you out. I'm going to say that you did these things that you didn't do. And so that's another place where I think we're going to have to develop advocacy around for survivors of sexual assault. And I think, too, that we're going to have to do some groundbreaking in terms of figuring out way that this new policy can be used for the best impact of survivors. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Another very key provision that we worked very hard on in VAWA was emergency transfer for victims. And this would give the victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking the ability to transfer from one unit to another for safety reasons. And this is a brand new provision. We really wanted this to be an absolute requirement that people would be given new housing if they needed to move as a result of sexual assault. Unfortunately, in the process of developing policy for the public housing managers, we did have to say that the language does say that it would have to be contingent on housing being available. And obviously, this is going to be a big issue because, as I mentioned in the beginning, there is often a waiting list for public housing. So this can be I think, is going to be one of the difficulties in implementing this provision, and also is a place where we're going to really need to be strong as advocates, pushing for survivors to be able to break their lease and move to a different public housing unit as a result of these VAWA protections. And I think this protection and all of them can be really used as a jumping off place for advocacy. So even though there may be places that these protections don't go deep enough or need to be expanded, advocates can use them as a jumping off place to say, hey, look, this protection is available, but then I'm going to push farther for this particular survivor because what they really need is this. So it can be used as a jumping off place. But HUD is required to adopt a model emergency transfer plan for use by public housing agencies, owners, managers, and other housing providers that are participating in HUD-covered programs. And that model emergency transfer plan has not been released yet. They're still working on that, and we've provided a lot of input to that, but we're still waiting. Victims of sexual assault, in addition to being able to qualify on a reasonable belief of imminent harm, so the way that victims of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and sexual assault could qualify for an emergency transfer is that they have a reasonable belief of imminent harm. But additionally, sexual assault survivors have to be assisted with transferring if the sexual assault occurred on the premises within 90 days prior to the transfer request. So that's an additional protection for survivors of sexual assault. And again, because of the scarcity of housing stock, this is a place that advocates will really have to push. And it also could be that, survivors may need to transfer across a housing program. So, for example, there may not be any housing available, or it may be too close to where the attack happened to be safe. And so, advocates really may have to push for housing in a different housing program across the city and that sort of thing. So this will be a big place for advocacy in the future. Okay, the next key provision allows for lease bifurcation and time for a victim to establish eligibility for public housing if they aren't already eligible. So this really directs PHAs or landlords to bifurcate a lease. So, for example, if an offender is on the lease and also the victim, and they could take the offender off the lease but allow the victim to stay in the public housing, preserving the survivor's tenancy rights. A new protection in VAWA 2013 that relates to lease bifurcation is say that just the offender is on the lease for some reason and they have to move as a result of the violence. The public housing agency or landlord has to provide the remaining tenant, the survivor, an opportunity to establish eligibility for that unit or a reasonable time to move or establish eligibility for another covered housing program. So if that person isn't on the lease as a result of VAWA 2013, that person has to be given time to either move or to qualify for public housing. So that really gives the person time to sort of figure out what their options are if it looks like they may have to move as a result of the offender being the sole person on the lease. The next key provision involves expanded documentation options. So one important thing to remember about the VAWA housing protections is that landlords and PHAs are free to take the survivor at her or his word that they're a survivor of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, or sexual assault. So there is no proof, there's no proof that a landlord has to ask for that this violence occurred. And typically, landlords can't actually require proof. For the VAWA housing protections that were passed in 2005 that related mostly to victims of domestic violence, HUD created an approved self-certification form, and so that was a form that survivors could fill out on their own or with the help of an advocate that basically said, I am a survivor, and give some information about that. It's unclear that at this point if that self-certification form is going to be also used for emergency transfers because obviously the emergency transfer policy is new. We've certainly made the case for that in our HUD comments, and we think it should be able to be used for that. And I would say right now there's probably enough wiggle room without regulations that I would certainly support advocates pushing that to use that form for an emergency transfer. And so I'm seeing a question from a participant, is a police report required to enact the emergency transfer provision? No, a police report can, and that's an excellent question. A police report can't be required, and this is part of the discussion we're having right now about documentation. A police report cannot be required for an emergency transfer. Now, that's not to say that there may be some misunderstanding of the law and that you might not hear somebody say, well, I'd like to see a police report. But it's important as advocates that we know that that can't be required. And again, we are awaiting final regulations, so it will be interesting to see what those say. In that regard, we pushed so hard. This is one of the issues that we pushed hardest on that. a police report not be required. As where VAWA stands right now in terms of housing protections, the only situation in which a third-party documentation of abuse can be required is if there are two people in the situation, which would mostly be domestic violence situations, that are saying they're the victim. So if both the offender and the victim are claiming to be a victim, then the landlord can require third-party documentation. But also third-party documentation, it could be like if there is a police report and the survivor wants to use that, they can, or they could also use if they have a protection order, but they don't have to. And they can also use, if they want to use third-party documentation, they can also use documentation from a service provider or like a mental health provider. So hopefully that answers that question. We are in a little bit of a gray area here because we're the HUD regulations on these issues. But like I said, I think both Donna and I really want to fully empower you to push for these protections even before the regulations come out. Okay, so moving on to the next key provision. HUD is required to give notice to, and public housing agencies and landlords are required to give notice to tenants of their VAWA rights, so at several different times. They're required to give notice to applicants. So when someone's applying for public housing, they're required to give notice of these VAWA housing protections. So for example, if someone applies for housing and they're denied, but they're denied, they believe, because they're a victim, then they can bring that forward, so they would have to know, obviously. So when they're denied housing, they need to be notified when they're admitted to public housing. So when they're get public housing, they need to be notified, and also when they're notified of eviction or termination. And the notice is required to be given in a way that those with limited English proficiency would be able to understand it. And we'll talk a little later about advocacy around all these pieces. And, you know, because these laws are new, it may be that some PHAs don't actually know that much about them yet, or they're still learning about them. So as advocates, you might actually have to bring forward the law to them. Okay, so moving on to the next key provision, which is voucher portability. If a Section 8 voucher family moves out in violation of a lease, the Public Housing Authority has grounds to terminate their subsidy. But VAWA provides an exception for survivors who must move for safety. Many PHAs prohibit Section 8 voucher tenants from moving during the first year of their lease or from moving more than once during a 12-month period. However, these policies do not apply when the move is needed for safety on the grounds of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or there's a question at this point about whether it will fully cover sexual assault because that wasn't laid out in the law, but we believe the intention was, and so that's an issue again where we may need to wait for some regulations with regard to voucher portability. Okay, and the last key provision I want to touch on briefly is confidentiality. So when a survivor is required to provide some sort of documentation or documents or even the self-certification form to claim their housing rights, housing providers are obligated to keep the information confidential. Under VAWA, housing providers are prohibited from disclosing any information a survivor provides to document incidents of violence. And they may not enter the information into any shared database or provide it to another entity. So VAWA has pretty strong housing protections. The transfer process obviously is new, so we're going to have to think again about confidentiality with the transfer process, and we have provided comment to HUD on this particular topic. So again, we're awaiting sort of what's the final regulation is going to look like with regard to the new VAWA 2013 housing provisions. Okay, now we're going to be moving on to part 3 of our webinar today, and that is talking about coalition advocacy, this will be local program advocacy strategies, actually. And I think, Donna, do you want to run the poll for us?
Sure. We have another poll for you, and we ask that you just take a minute to talk about what statement is best reflecting where you're at right now with housing advocacy. Do you feel like you're very involved and that you're always at the table with housing providers or when housing is being discussed in your community? Are you somewhat involved, sometimes at the table? or are you not involved quite yet when collaborating with housing providers or on housing issues in your community? Okay, so it looks like the majority of us are not involved yet. So a lot of us are not at the table with housing providers or when housing issues are being discussed. And that we're seeing that, Terry and I are seeing that quite consistently across that in this section, and maybe ways to get more involved. So thank you for responding to the poll. So I think related to the poll, housing is not always seen as a core service or a part of sort of what we do at local programs. We're struggling with keeping hotlines going and just staying afloat and keeping our doors open. So really looking at adding another area of practice can really seem daunting and overwhelming. So Terry and I really wanted to kind of talk through how we can really make a case for housing as an area of our advocacy by looking at our mission statement, looking at our organizational structure, and kind of going back and looking at our role in working with survivors holistically, meaning looking at their strengths and their needs, which include economic security and housing issues. And when we look closely at our mission statements, it's really seeing a role for housing in those statements, and systems advocacy being such a rich part of our history as a movement, we can start to see housing as something that we definitely can do because we have skills to bring to, and it can be another system that we sort of add to law enforcement and medical, and we just embrace, you know, those skills that we have as systems advocates on behalf of survivors. So we wanted to kind of start there because we felt like our mission statements definitely do help us make a case organizationally and in our community for being at that table and for voicing the needs of sexual assault survivors. And that really helps us set the stage to talk about collaborations. And I think the poll reflected a little bit, and I know I hear quite often in technical assistance requests and training, we're sort of working in these silos, and we're just trying to sort of stay focused on the needs of the day. But we also know that when we do reach out across issues and across topics in our community, that we can be much more impactful. We know that sexual assault survivors are not walking pie charts. We know that we need to embrace them holistically in the entirety of their lives, making housing a really important issue. So I think Terry's going to start talking a little bit about how we can really connect with our housing partners. I think some of the key principles of collaboration is you keep showing up at that table, you develop relationships over time, keep offering to provide the good technical assistance and training that you all have to share around sexual violence and the consequences of sexual violence and how they connect with housing, offer to do trainings with housing providers, offer to provide services in housing programs for survivors. There's really just, when you look at all of the ways to collaborate with any community partner, all of those things definitely are relevant, and you all have those wonderful skills to bring to housing providers.
Great, Donna, thanks. And yeah, Donna and I really see this as the, just as she mentioned, as we've developed, become such good system advocates around the criminal justice system, we see this sort of as a new system for us to become expert advocates negotiating. And just with all good systems advocacy, of course, it's going to take a lot of community organizing skills and work. In some cases, you might have a local homelessness or housing task force that you can get involved with. And sometimes if you're working in a dual program, sometimes the domestic violence aspect of dual programs is already pretty involved in housing work, just because of the domestic violence field has been more intimately involved in housing over the years in terms of both shelter and longer-term housing. So it could be that you need to, as a sexual assault advocate, be more involved with that aspect of a dual program. For those of you who aren't in dual programs, you may want to, talk to or coalesce with domestic violence programs or agencies in your community, because sometimes, obviously, they are already working with the local homelessness or housing task force, and that can be a good way to go. Oftentimes, legal services or legal aid organizations are actively involved in housing work, and they can be great partners. They've been great partners to us on the national level. For one thing, they have such a deep understanding of the law, and I have a social work background, as does Donna, and I think as all good Renaissance advocates, we have learned quite a bit about different areas of the law, but sometimes it can be really beneficial to either bounce something off an attorney or have an attorney write a letter for your client. So those relationships can be very beneficial. It can be great to plan a visit to your local public housing agency as a way of getting started. And remember, as I mentioned before, that these laws are new. So housing providers may just be starting to think about that, and so you can offer yourself as a resource and a sexual assault expert on the front end to help with implementation. And Peter, you can advance the slide. Because it may be very helpful for them to hear from you about what survivors need. You might offer a sexual violence 101 training for your public housing agency as a way of building a relationship, or even you could consider offering some programming for sexual assault survivors in the public housing context. So just make sure that they know that you are a resource to help them to come into compliance with the new laws. You might also consider doing an informational piece for either housing agencies or for survivors in the housing context that talk about the new laws and ways that you can be useful to them in implementing them. So we talked some about who possible partners might be in this work. You might work with homeless shelter managers, obviously public housing authorities, and Peter, you can go on to that next slide. Legal aid and sexual assault attorneys we mentioned, domestic violence shelter managers or directors. You might also have legislators in your community, or county commissioners or city commissioners or a mayor's commission that's very involved in housing, or people have been active around housing or community development agency, where maybe taking on issues for survivors of sexual violence might be the next step for them, or they might have a natural interest there in housing. It could be law enforcement, and I'm sure you could think of other programs, transitional housing programs, faith-based programs that provide a wide variety of social services, including housing work. So I'm going to turn it over to Donna now to talk a little bit about prevention and some other advocacy pieces.
Thank you. So as advocates, one of the most powerful things you probably witness when you're working with survivors is asking questions that really help people make connections between the sexual violence that they've experienced and other aspects of their lives. So when we think about applying those wonderful skills that you have to housing, you can really draw from what you know about being present with people, meeting people where they're at, the active listening skills that you have, really knowing the rights and resources of survivors in the community, so knowing the housing rights and really understanding, as Terry said, using those rights as a springboard for more advocacy and action in your community. Safety planning, and really identifying people's strengths and helping them navigate those challenges. So assessing housing is something you can really draw from, your years of experience in asking good questions and then understanding how you can be a resource to survivors. And the next slide, we have a case study to help us sort of practice those skills. And the scenario is that you're working with a woman who tells you that since being raped, she has really struggled to hold down a job. She tells you that she was living in public housing but had to leave. She and her daughter have been staying with a friend, but she doesn't know how long that will last. So when Terry and I put this together, this is based on an actual scenario that we were given when we did some surveys with advocates. And we thought this might help us in sort of practicing our good advocacy and assessment skills. And I guess the question would be, what more would you want to know? And to think about what words you would use to find that out, to find out more about what she needs in terms of housing. And if you could just take a couple minutes and respond in the chat, that would be great. Are we seeing anything come your way, Peter?
Not as of yet. We have one. Can you tell me more about your previous living situation? Is something this person might ask.
Great. So understanding what were the circumstances, she tells you that she was living in public housing but had to leave. So that's a great question, finding more about what were the circumstances surrounding that. And as Terry mentioned, one of the new protections for sexual assault survivors is protection from eviction and termination based on status as a victim. So that would be a great sort of area to pursue with the survivor, better understanding what those circumstances were and then helping her access protections if that was relevant to her. Very good. Some other things that have come up when we've talked with other advocates is, has she pursued crime victims compensation? Are there workplace accommodations available to her? She says she's having a really tough time holding down a job. Again, understanding what led up to her feeling like she had to leave her past residence. Are there possible protections in VAWA that could help her? And also, what's her current living circumstance like? Is she feeling safe? Does she feel her daughter is safe in her current residence? So these are all great questions to consider. And again, sometimes just opening up that dialogue can really be powerful for survivors. So we can go on to the next slide. So many of you may already be asking survivors about housing and economic security needs, and we really encourage you to share those strategies with each other in an ongoing way. But these are just some examples in the next few slides of some of the words you can use as a springboard for having this dialogue with survivors. And this example really helps to normalize that sexual violence can affect us in a variety of ways and affect our sense of safety and peace at home and in other settings like the workplace and other community settings. So just opening up, do you feel like your assault is negatively affecting you in terms of housing, and seeing where that leads. And the next slide is just another example of how to engage people in conversations about housing. And this gets at acknowledging and validating the many effects of sexual violence that can really intensify at home. I know Maxine Harris does a lot of research on and writing on trauma and what trauma-informed housing can really look like. And in her writing, she talks about how in the home environment, some of these effects of sexual violence can really intensify and be magnified. So really looking at what are some of these consequences that survivors are facing as a result of their sexual trauma and helping them navigate that and even make their home environments feel safer and more peaceful. And the next slide is another example, and this really gets at the rights and resources that are available now through the Violence Against Women Act, and as Terry said, and other legislation in your state, that people have a right to live free from violence and abuse, and to really talk with folks about what those rights and resources are in the community. And, the bulk of this presentation was really looking at leveraging these protections on behalf of survivors. And I think it's really important to also look at housing as a prevention strategy, knowing that housing can be a protective factor against sexual violence perpetration, and it's critical for victims and survivors in reducing sexual violence. So I don't think we have all of the answers right now about any of this, but some really good questions to be exploring together in your communities is how can we also be engaging housing providers not only in protecting the rights of victims and survivors, but also in creating safe spaces that are free from violence to begin with. So what do the policies look like? What does bystander intervention look like in a housing setting? And what about leadership in the housing environment and other strategies that can really help us in creating, homes and housing units that are free from violence to begin with? So where do we go from here? We covered a lot of ground in about 50 minutes so far. Terry and I put together an action plan that we encourage you to use. I think it was one of the handouts that came along with the other materials for today's webinar. You can go to the next slide. The handout really groups some strategies in 3 main categories. And the first is engaging your colleagues in your own organization and sharing information about housing with your colleagues, with your directors, with the folks that you're already talking with about the rights and needs of survivors of sexual violence. The next sort of area of things to think about in creating a strategy is engaging your community and better understanding what the needs are in your community around housing and sexual violence, and who are some new partners you can reach out to, and then also looking at your existing partnerships and bringing housing to those task forces and conversations if it's not already on sort of the agenda of those task forces. And then the third area, of course, is engaging survivors and really building up those assessment tools and being able to really help folks navigate their protections and rights and resources in the community around housing. And Terry and I would love to continue this dialogue with you, and as you are using these worksheets to create some action steps, we'd love to provide additional training and technical assistance and to help connect you to other folks around the country that are also looking at these questions and strategies. And I think our contact information.
Oh, sorry, Donna.
Oh, I was just going to say our contact information, I think, is on the next slide. There we go.
Yeah, and if you're able to use the new housing protections for survivors or hearing your particular stories, we're always glad to hear those too. Because I mean, as we're sharing some information with you, it's really beneficial to us both from the policy and the technical assistance arenas to really understand what's going on in the field with this work too. So we hope you'll stay in touch with us. And I think that brings us to the end. If you want to forward it just to the references page, I think that brings us to the end of our formal presentation. If there are any additional questions, we are completely happy to address those or discuss them.
Hi, Terry. This is Steve from WCASA. I have a question regarding the documentation provisions in VAWA. It states that it does have some other protections, but it requires like an injunction from a complaint. So, for Wisconsin residents who are in public housing, with the VAWA protections, because they kind of offer greater protection for survivors, with those control, I mean, I think that's...
So I hear some background noise, but I can't quite tell if I don't think it's a question. And I'm wondering if there are any additional questions. Okay, well, Donna, anything you want to add?
No, I also hear, it sounds like someone is trying to share a question, but I'm unable to hear it as well.
Hi, Terry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I've got Ian Hendrickson here. I'm going to give him the mic, and he has a question for you.
Okay.
Hi, Terry. So
Ian.
Wisconsin law has some housing protections available for survivors, like getting out of their lease and changing the locks. But they do require documentation, like an injunction or a criminal complaint. So I guess my question goes to looking at the slide about VAWA housing protections not needing that level of documentation. So for Wisconsin residents in public housing or Section 8, would they be able to take advantage of the VAWA provisions?
And they should be. Again, we're in a little bit of a gray area because HUD has not promulgated their regulations on the new provisions yet, and they have also not put out their model transfer plan. And so, I mean, and working nationally with a coalition of advocates, none of us think that we need to wait to push for survivors' protections under VAWA. At the same time, the administrators may feel a little like, well, we just don't know for sure. I think it's a really ripe area for advocacy, and I think it would be great if people, try writing letters for survivors based on the, or, having conversations for survivors, obviously with informed consent, for survivors based on the VAWA housing protections and see what happens. I think we need to just kind of develop, we will probably have to proactively develop the law to a certain extent, but there is nothing in law that requires a police report or an injunction or protection order or anything like that at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad to know that you all have those additional protections as well. Do the Wisconsin protections go beyond public housing? Because one of the real limits of VAWA is these protections are only in the public housing context. And it sounds like they do, but often when there's strong state law, it's very helpful because again, just a limitation of the federal law at this point is these housing protections are only in the public housing context. So sometimes if there's a broader state law, if there's a survivor that's not in public housing, the state laws that are used there, obviously.
There's a question.
Question both in the chat. Yeah.
Have you seen the chat questions, or do you want me to read them off?
Oh, I'm sorry. I only see the one that was earlier about a police report. I haven't seen any others.
Oh, okay.
I don't think I have access to the
Susan, you had a question. Let me unmute you and you can ask it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question was, does this new protection include Indian housing?
That is a good question. I don't think so specifically. Is that a separate, specific federal housing program, and is it out of HUD or not? No.
It's out of HUD.
It is out of HUD?
Housing? Yes.
It's called HUD Indian Housing?
Yes.
I don't think it was one of the specific named ones, but you know what? That's an excellent question, and if the folks at the coalition want to connect us by email, I would be glad to find out from some of the national providers that we work with. But I'm not familiar with it being in the list of covered programs. Do you know anything else about that, Donna?
I don't. I think it's a great question for us to look into. Thank you for asking.
Yes, and also, if I could find out what protections are available through Indian housing.
Yeah, that's a great connection. I mean, a great question. Hopefully we can get connected by email, and then I know some people who know housing law in a much deeper way than I do, and I'm glad to try to kind of figure out the answer to that for you.
I'm a new advocate, I'm trying to look for more information. I'll be working with people through public housing and Indian housing both. So
Great.
This is great information.
I'll connect you guys after the webinar.
Great.
Thank you.
And Stephanie, you had a question as well?
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I just had a question
for like evasion or or perhaps a felon for a nonviolent crime, are they still eligible for the housing protections under VAWA?
Donna, could you hear that question? I caught like every other word of it.
Same here. It kept cutting out. I'm so sorry.
Do you want to try one more time?
Sure. I was asking, for example, if there was a victim that was either on probation or have a criminal background, are they still eligible for housing protections under VAWA?
Yes. Yes, they would be.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure, great question.
And Anne, you had a question too. I'll unmute you. Anne had a question about in an emergency transfer situation and in general, is there an SA victim moved to the front of the line, as it were, for housing?
Well, in a way, it's sort of, I mean, you mean to actually get access to public housing? We don't have that. But we have pushed in the regulations that if somebody needs to, in public housing and they need to transfer as a result of sexual assault, that they be given preference. We've asked for that in the regulations. We really don't know how exactly public housing programs are going to respond to that. And again, that may be a great place for advocacy. I mean, I would certainly push for that. There isn't something formal that says they go to the front of the line necessarily, except for if they already are in public housing, then they should be, the transfer is sort of in a way putting them to the front of the line. I know that's not an exact answer. Donna, do you have anything you want to add about that?
Just that I think with some of our national partners, there's been some advocacy to connect this with the voucher portability and making sure there's sort of a pot of vouchers that are protected for domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence survivors. I think there was some recent advocacy that there be sort of this protected pool of vouchers to help with that. But again, as Terry said, nothing concrete just yet.
That's an excellent question and an excellent point, Donna, about the portability. And not to be, I hope not too redundant, but again, like I think this is a really great place for advocacy. So federal law may take you a certain distance, but then as an advocate, you can certainly push beyond that for survivors, and the federal law might at least get your foot in the door.
And I think, too, it's important to add, when we think about the emergency transfer, the way the language was written, it really does leave room for sexual assault survivors. When we think about imminent harm, Terry and I and our national partners really advocated that that be defined very broadly, because we know that harm and safety can look very different across sort of domestic violence and sexual violence survivors and experiences. So as an advocate, it really does leave you room to talk about psychological safety, emotional safety, and sort of that full spectrum on behalf of survivors. So to keep that in mind, too, in the context of emergency transfers.
Yes, that's a really important point.
Jessica, you had a question. Let me unmute you. Her question was, would a male victim of sexual assault qualify for protections under VAWA?
Yes, a male victim would. Great question.
That was the end of the questions on the chat.
Okay, Donna, I bet you feel the same way. It's absolutely thrilling to be getting these questions. Sometimes on
I know.
webinars,
Yes.
there aren't a lot of questions or interaction, and we both really enjoy when we hear participant questions and engagement. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Those are great questions.
And we hope that you'll stay in touch with us as we collectively develop, you know, an approach to sexual assault housing, public housing advocacy. And thanks to the Wisconsin Coalition for sponsoring today. It's been great working with you guys.